Uh,
Good. Uh,
Sveiki visi.
that's what great.
Um, or hi everyone. Today we have a wonderful workshop by Herkus on debating arts and culture, which is going to also be the theme of this weekend's motion. Without further ado, go on.
Yeah. Thank you for the beautiful welcome. It's great to see everyone and many different beautiful anime related profile pics. I love that. Um, yeah, so what we're going to be talking today about is debating arts and culture. Particularly, I'm going to sort of talk through a bit more theoretical lens on talking about like national identity, collective memory, and real world implications of debating arts and culture. Um, we're going to sort of do this in 5 bits. First, we'll talk how do you debate arts and culture? Why do we debate it? Then we're going to talk about what is national culture? Why does it matter? I'm going to sort of walk you through a little quick case study, and then we can discuss. Um, I warn you, this will be a little theory heavy, um, but I'll sort of explain why that's important. But that is to say that at any point, if you have a question or want me to clarify or slow down or sort of explain something again, please feel free to do so. I'm more than happy to do that. This is a topic I am very passionate about, so if you get me going, I will not stop. So, yeah, why do we debate arts and culture? We debate arts and culture for their social, political, and material importance rather than, you know, is this artwork good? Is this, a quality thing? Is this a culturally significant thing? I think a large problem with arts and culture debates, even at the very highest levels of debate, is that they're often quite bad because people sort of forget that very deceptively, kind of, arts and culture debates aren't about arts and culture. We don't, there is that saying that you don't dispute taste, and exactly this is the sort of the question of hand. We debate arts and culture because they have some sort of impact onto the real material, political, and social lives we lead. So there's sort of three pieces of advice I'd suggest you sort of keep in mind as we debate arts and culture in the future. First of all, think materially. Consider arts and culture in the context of institutions, human decisions, and the material world. What does that mean? Arts and culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have some arts that are state-sponsored and taught in schools through literature classes, exhibited in museums through nationally sort of significant museums. They're public art like monuments. All of that could be construed as part of like it can fairly concerted effort from an official, maybe government actor, maybe private actor, to try and portray a particular type of cultural narrative. But we also have sort of like counterculture and underground art. We know that people and movements use art and culture to present a different narrative and to claim their stake in the democratic political sphere. So whenever you are discussing arts and culture, try to think about what groups are they related to? How do people access this culture? Where do people see it? And what does it take for a person to engage with this? If you have that consideration in mind, you'll be able to make a much more cogent argument. Point two, be realistic. I think a lot of the time, even quite good debaters, sort of in pursuit of a good argument or strong impact, really overvalue arts and culture. So, be realistic. If we change what art we exhibit in a museum or what literature we teach, there's going to be some sort of, cultural, social, and historical impact, but probably, the entire way of how we live is not going to be changed by that. Try to sort of either come about it through a systemic lens and talk about the material impact, the political, and the social impact on top of the cultural change, and don't sort of make a silly claim that, if we change what we teach our children, the world will be entirely different, which isn't always the case. And finally, contextualize. Arts and culture debates can get very fluffy. Um, you can get judges on your side if you can make your argument concrete. So if you're talking about post-colonial art and culture, try to have some arguments on your side, which means basically the impact of this piece of advice is get informed, like catch up to the most prominent arts and culture debates that are out there. You can start with something like quite prolific and prominent, like the question of returning the Elgin marbles, or post-colonial reparations, giving back artifacts from the British Museum or the German Museum back to formerly colonized nations. I think those are pretty good introductory pieces, but from that you can branch out and see why do people care so much about, you know, statues, let's say, or pieces of literature. And from there on, you'll have a sort of repository of things and debates that exist in the world to engage with. Um, um, and now I'm going to give you a sort of overview of how we can consider arts and culture within the sort of like larger social sphere. And I'm going to give you examples from three different theorists that together sort of build up the question of what is national culture, and will lead into a discussion of why is that important. So Benedict Anderson, in his book Imagined Communities, builds a very sort of controversial back then, but very sort of neat and pretty tight argument, claiming that nations are modern and imagined communities. What does that mean? Is that, you know, I'd imagine many of you attending this session today have imagined themselves to be part of a national community, right? We are, Lithuanian, something else, and we sort of feel a certain kinship with other people of our nationality, of our nation, even though, we'll probably never meet them. We might not even be materially connected to them. And other than like us both thinking that we are part of the same nation, we don't really have that much in common. Um, so what Anderson suggests is that there is a sort of limitation to how many people you can fit in that community, and what has to be true about it is it has to be sovereign to sort of feel real and important. So what he says is, I propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. How we imagine this, Anderson claims, is predominantly through engaging with arts and culture. So one of the greatest examples he gives is the newspaper. We all, let's say, open Delphi on the same day, and we read of the same events. We know of the same people. We share sort of common baseline knowledge of what is going on in the country, certain shared cultural references, and shared sort of appreciations or dislikes of a particular sort of artwork, let's say. Um, and that creates a community for Anderson, because regardless of the actual inequality or exploitation that may prevail in each community, right? It's not necessarily that just because we're both of the same nation mean that we have the same sort of relationship to each other. Um, the nation is, however, always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it's this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginings, right? There we have the most sort of famous or infamous saying of the 19th century and the 20th century. Um, it's a good thing to die for your motherland. Here we already see how we can think of arts and culture in a much more constructive setting, right? So outside of debating the contents of sort of cultural production and artistic production, we can see how it might have an impact on binding people together. Um, Obviously, we then need to consider how is it that the cultural artifacts are disseminated? Is it, publicly accessible thing like the newspapers, or, in a more modern era, um, social media, or digital media, or is it more exclusive and more venerated as a paid museum that only exists in the capital city, and maybe like 2% of the nation has ever been to. So already we can sort of think about, okay, what does this mean for people's actual lived lives? Um, this lovely French man here named Maurice Alvas, in the early 20th, late 19th century, um, sort of created a bit of an underpinning to this whole um, argument, is that not only are nations bound together by contemporary events, right? It's not that we just read the newspaper together and we imagine ourselves to be part of the same nation, but by a notion called collective memory. And it's based on the premise that no memory is possible outside frameworks used by people living in society to determine and retrieve their recollections. What this means, basically, is that, communities, we don't think of them as entirely sort of contemporary creatures. We also imagine that there is a past that we all share, right? In Lithuania, we sort of imagine that, or remember rather, that there is a common past, spanning thousands of years, and it sort of defines us and bonds us all together, even though we don't necessarily know if like our ancestors actually participated in the past or what was the role in that past. But we have this sort of collective memory and artifact um, that help us draw that argument of continuation. And Alvarez suggests that units capable of having collective memory, i.e., frameworks for interpreting past events in history, range from families to nations, with him arguing that collectively remembering traits, events, and figures is a key tool for groups to define their traits. Basically, the way we remember our past is the way we imagine ourselves today. And what our collective memory is constructed out of is often a product of deliberate and official inclusion or exclusion of events, figures, and values. So this is a book called The Realms of Memory by this French historian, Pierre Nora, who basically claims that because we live in sort of this very modern age where we actually spend most of our times doing things that other than remembering the past, we have actually chosen to institutionalize certain memorials, traditions, rituals, celebrations that comprise our national culture and that serve as the touch points that construct our collective memory. So these might be a monument, this might be a parade, this might be, wearing the Noshmurshwala on January 13th, right? Um, a lot of them are quite material and symbolic, right? They are often generally imposed from above by the government or some official organization, and they're pretty solemn. And they exist because we need to have a shared collective understanding if we want to sort of claim a stake to ourselves as a nation. So if we want to make the claim of, you know, the French are like this, let's say they are a military nation, then we want to memorialize. Okay, we have monuments to great military successes like the Arc of Triumph. We have parades memorializing particular battles. We have monuments idolizing particular figures. We teach literature related to those particular figures, and that's how we build our understanding of ourselves as a nation with a particular trait. Um, so overall, we see that through reading Anderson, Albaz, and Nora, what we can arrive at is an understanding that every day the notion of national culture is constructed and reconstructed, right? We continuously engage with it, but the way we engage with it on a daily basis is very much rooted in the way we interpret ourselves, which is itself informed by how we understand our past. And the way we understand our past is often through very official um, elements of art and culture that construct a national culture. Um, this has been pretty dense. So if there's any questions, I think that would be a really good time to, pop in, ask any sort of clarifying or follow-up questions before we get into why does this matter to begin with. You can go in the chat, you can go anywhere. If not, I'll move on. But I'll give everyone a minute to sort of think about it. Yeah, Jurgis, can you speak? Yeah.
Hey, you might actually have this in your presentation later, but all of the free authors kind of suggest that there's a lot that really influences us, but then there's also
Mhm.
like a part of autonomy where it's our like we ourselves understand what's what the culture is and we perceive it. So like how much do we have a choice to really shape our understanding, and how much are we influenced by tradition?
Um, it's a good question. I think I would argue that we are influenced by tradition a lot more than we're not, in the sense that that is given through so many sort of institutional um, interactions, right? You go to school for 12 years. In school, they tell you this is what our history is like. This is what we remember. This is what we value. This is what it's important to us. Then you go out into the street and you walk around your city and you see monuments that sort of reinforce that narrative. You participate in celebrations that reinforce that narrative. You observe parades that feel that there's so many more people celebrating that narrative. Of course, that doesn't mean that like that tradition is necessarily the end all be all. There's ways of, you know, you can have different recollections of the memory through your family. If you participate in sort of extra official reading, learning, or even reading in a different language, you get exposed to a different way of remembering and understanding events. And after a certain point, you can make a particular decision as a person or a group of people to disagree with a sort of official national tradition. But that is, I would venture to argue, a point of much more intensive consideration, deliberation than most people would care to do about national history. But again, it does happen, right? And I think so much of history and political events is, uh, in one way or another, a sort of conflict between different ways of imagining what communities are and stand for.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you guys can hear me fine. Herkus, can you nod if you can hear me?
I can
I
hear you.
Yeah, my speaker sounds are messed up, so I was listening through my phone and just stopped on to say. I think a large point of what Jurgis is asking, and how specifically it relates to debating, is that debate debates usually are about nuance. So that means that inherently, like, it's hard to answer for Herkus whether one or the other is more important. And similarly, in debates, you are likely to have to weigh certain factors beyond just saying that it's a yes or no, or this is stronger and that is stronger clearly. Because if one narrative was truly always correct, the debate wouldn't exist. The motion wouldn't be set unless, the cap was people who are amateurish, I will say. We rarely have those. So, yeah, just popping in to say that, always try to analyze with nuance. Best of luck to everyone with the remainder of the workshop. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you for both.
Yeah, and on top of that, I'd say another thing is that even sort of like what we consider tradition or official narratives are pretty malleable and they change a lot, right? If like a large group of people now want to celebrate a particular historical memory in one way, for example, the same example of Neužmirštuolis during January 13th, right? That came up as a sort of like civic um, organization that then was later endorsed by the state and it sort of became a more official thing. So the official narrative of what is tradition can be changed by people who are interested in doing so. And particularly when we're talking about democratic countries, it will be responsive to popular pressures. It might suppress some, and that's where a lot of sort of tension and debate worthiness arises. I think I had something else, but it might come back to me. Are there any other questions? If not, I will keep going. Yeah, and sort of one final bit is that, you know, I was talking maybe a bit more abstractly of like official sort of moments of commemoration, or things that sort of influence how we think of our past, of our collective memory, and how we think of ourselves. Um, but here's some pretty concrete examples, right? We can What is on our money matters, right? Like the figures we choose to celebrate matter, right? Who we build monuments to matter, right? It could be just sort of like general political ideal, like the Statue of Liberty. In New York, you can see it, and it sort of would present the argument of like, oh, America is a country that cares about democracy and liberty. Whether that's true is less important than like what it claims to believe, and if people believe in it, then they can sort of you know ignore or not necessarily respond to the lived realities of whether or not it actually like cares about liberty. You can build monuments to religious figures to claim that we, I guess in this case, we the Thais are a Buddhist nation. We care about Buddhism, and this is what defines us as a nation. And this is often a point of contention and point of debate in many countries because, um, you know, other than Poland, really, and like Saudi Arabia, most nations are pretty, multi-religious. So a government or even official, unofficial, sort of private associations choosing to sort of impose this symbolism and importance of a particular religion or a particular ideology can often erase certain populations from the national imagination. It also, is a question of who do we name our streets after? Who do we memorialize? And in the bottom right, you see the picture of the British Museum. Is whose artwork do we have in our museums, right? In the case of the British Museum, it's a very common debate. If you ever go there, it's filled with basically loot they have from their colonies, which if you go there, you can sort of think, huh, Britain is above all a imperial nation because that's what they have there. And that will sort of, again, inform people of how to think of their country when it comes to foreign relations, when it comes to their role in the world and their relationship to people that are descendants of former colonies within the nation. But yeah, so nations are constructed. So what? What does it matter? I want you to answer this. Someone just like pop into the stage. What do you see in this map? Anyway, I do not bite. You can also write in the chat. What do you see in this map? This sort of tease too long, but what do we have here are nation states, right? Like by and large, we live in a world where most countries, be they ethnically united or ethnically diverse, continuously create a notion that there is, a nation, that there is, a Brazilian nation, a Lithuanian nation, an American nation, a Chinese nation, Australian nation, whatever, that has, much like Anderson claims, a limit, right? Some people get to be Chinese and some people don't. And that they have sovereignty, right? That they have territory in which they have sort of like all the power. And in a world of nation state, construction of national culture is very important because it informs questions of who gets to participate, who gets to share power, who gets to be in power, and who gets to belong. I think in the debating context, you would mostly talk about democratic nations because I mean you could talk about like the national construction of North Korea, but it doesn't really mean all that much because you don't get to have that democratic back and forth to determine who gets to participate in the national debate when there isn't really one. Um, but in most democratic countries, this is a very salient question. You know, if you claim that, as for example, our neighbor country Poland did, that we are a Catholic country, and like the president attends a mass where Jesus is crowned as the King of Poland, then probably people that aren't quite so allegiant to that religion are somewhat discredited and they are sort of considered to be somewhat outside the norms of the country and don't really get that much legitimacy to belong and participate in the sort of institutions of power. And my earlier point about the fact that a lot of this reproduction and production of national culture happens through education, through everyday life in cities, through interacting with the country, means that in a world where most people go to like school and national elites are formed out of people who go to like the good schools and get to have a high-end university education. Um, this is really important because if we determine, meritocracy and elitism through how well we go through institutions, we also need to recognize that those institutions not only convey, education, but also have a degree of like inculturation into a national culture through the exposition to arts, culture, um, and related elements. So this really arts and culture debates are often important and they often sort of rely on questions in this very simplistic mechanism of basically us versus them. Who gets to be part of us? Do we consider, through artistic representation, do we consider a particular ethnic minority to be part of our nation? Or do we consider them to be an equal part of our nation or they are a subordinate one? Whose voices matter, right? If for example, you are in America, a country that considers itself to be like first and foremost sort of like all about liberty, capitalism, democracy, if you espouse views that aren't necessarily directly about that, there is historical precedent of suppressing those voices. And, at the same time, you get to define, after you've defined the limits of who are we and who do we listen to, you get to determine what are traits and beliefs. So a really, good example of it is a lot of sort of German official national culture, particularly after the war. What they then celebrate is their industrial prowess or the ability to save money. And then, as a result of that, consecutive German governments have made sort of economically unsound policies that are very much centered in the idea that because we are German, we have to have a policy of national saving, or because we are German and we are good at engineering, we have to put in money into our engineering companies, even if they aren't necessarily profitable globally. But the important corollary to us is them, if we are a nation that is limited, there are other nations and other countries outside of our limits. Through national culture, we can quite well imagine and convey our relationship to those others. A really good example, those of you from Kaunas would know, in Laisvės alėja, there's a statue of Vytautas the Great that was originally built in the interwar period. And if you look into it, what it represents is Vytautas standing on top of a sort of cowering Pole, German, and Russian. Back in the interwar era, this was a very sort of officially condoned narrative that our relationship to sort of these foreign nations and foreign powers is one where we are in opposition, this acrimonious relationship, we are in combat, and we are better than them in some way or another, and thus must win. And that's how we can sort of acculturate people to think, okay, what do we think those other nations want from us, and how do we see them? And an interesting example of defining who us are, in this case, is South Africa. So after 1994, when apartheid ended, the post-colonial, post-apartheid South African government, led by the African National Congress, decided that instead of following a sort of post-colonial nation-building route, where many countries chose to center, the fact that they struggled against their colonial overlords as the key element of their national culture, they said, well, we are a very multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multiracial nation, and let's maybe sort of try to focus on the things that unite us. So they changed their flag to what you see right now on the slide, to represent the fact that it is a quote-unquote rainbow nation, as the policy said. And, you have like a representation of the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Ndebele people, the Afrikaners, the English, etc. Most sort of national symbolism then relied on the fact that, it has a very rich nature and sort of everything. It's something that all the people had in common. So the post stamps, a lot of the money would represent the springbok, which is South Africa's national animal, or the lion, or things like that. A lot of publicly endorsed art, again, was centered on natural beauty rather than one or another ethnic group, to create this myth that, well, what our national culture is the fact that we inhabit this land. With one exception, of course, is that many street signs, many sculptures, and the obverse of the money was decorated with the African National Congress figures, so Nelson Mandela or Tambo, and some others, suggesting a sort of corollary to this, that if we are to be a peaceful, united rainbow nation that gets to inhabit this land, and we get to forget about our ethnic divisions, our racial struggles, our colonial past, there's only one political force that can unite us. And this is, Jurgis, where your question actually becomes important again, that after 20 or so years of trying this national culture, many people looked at their, material situation and they saw that, well, hang on, apartheid is over, but, the racial divisions of income inequality, of wealth inequality, of access to employment, etc., have not been changed that much, and the whole idea of the Rainbow Nation doesn't actually reflect the real sort of divisions that still exist. So many campaigns, like, for example, Roads Must Fall, began calling for tearing down any statues that sort of have any bearing to the colonial past, and trying to really push forward a indigenous South African sort of Xhosa, Zulu, and Ndebele figures, rather than focus um, on trying to preserve unity with the people that, stole a lot of people's land and imprisoned many people and tortured many people. Um, and that gave rise to many different political figures, including Julius Malema here, who actually went against the African National Congress and started using this post-colonial rhetoric. And he's very famous for singing the song called "Kill the Boer" or "Kill the Afrikaner," white South African farmer, um, to sort of like really create these grand moments of uniting many people in song and participating in a sort of like a cultural celebration, um, for political ends. So here we see it's a very interesting case study where you can try to have peace in a very tense situation. And we must remember that in 94, when apartheid was ending, South Africa was almost in a state of civil war. And the project of creating like this Rainbow Nation culture was a project of maintaining unity and peace. But without a sort of like material transformation, many people sort of became disillusioned and lost buy-in into it, and therefore started their own sort of cultural touch points and fighting against existing cultural touch points to unite themselves both ideologically, politically, and in other ways, to claim a stake to what their country should look like were they to take power. So yeah, I think it's enough of me talking at you. Please, we can have a little discussion about this, or questions, answers, thought starters, anything is welcome. Yeah, whatever you guys would like to talk about, I'm here for as long as you want me to be. Yeah.
Do you think that nationality is still prevalent as an identity nowadays with nowadays discourse? And like to what extent is it prevalent? Or what could be like the alternative, I don't know, things that people identify with?
I think national culture is extremely important as as an identity. If we look at what's happening politically in Europe, we have this whole rise of very far-right movements claiming that we need to go back to the nation state, and Italy is for the Italians, Germany is for the Germans, etc. Hungary is for the Hungarians, and at the same time we have countries like France trying to experiment, going beyond ethnicity to unite, um, French citizens, be they of French ethnicity, Algerian ethnicity, Moroccan ethnicity, whatever, to create a nation where you know could overcome those ethnic divisions, and you could use the idea of like a French national culture to unite people to care about the country. I think as a political tool, as a unifying tool, as a cultural tool, nationality is extremely important these days, and arguably even growing in importance as you know demographic makeups of countries change, um, as sort of right wing politics takes up bigger importance globally. And I think another corollary of this is that nationality will always be salient in as much as we all live in nation states, and it impacts where you can live, right? If you are, say, not American, you can't go live in America. They won't let you. Um, and they keep talking about how we need to get rid of everyone who isn't sort of a native born American. If you watch the Republican debates that are happening these days. So yeah, I think it's definitely salient. What could replace it is a good question. Um, you know, Marxist take would be that we could, all unite under the banner of the working class, and the working class has no nationalities and no boundaries. That's one. Um, you know, on the contrary, many claim that it is in fact the global bourgeoisie who are very connected, have many passports, live globally, are the sort of like the post-nationality group, and coordinate sort of global capital um, to the detriment of many sort of national proletariat. Um, you, there have been thinkers that have argued that race is a sort of important unifying factor. There have been thinkers like Aimé Césaire, and his name escapes me, but he's from Senegal. Leopold Senghor, who claimed that globally across the Americas and Africa, people of African descent, Black people, should unite together and build their own identity, regardless of language and nationality. So there's many different sort of counterpoints you could have to nationality, but in as much as, again, we live in a world where nations are, we claim constitutionally states derive their power from, it's a pretty important category.
Okay, thank you. What's your take?
All right. Well, thank you all for coming and spending part of your evening with us. I really appreciate you for doing that, and I hope this was helpful or has, sparked some interesting thoughts. And feel free to reach out to me on Discord if you want to sort of like ask any other questions. If not, have a lovely evening and enjoy the debate this weekend. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Herkus, for your workshop. We'll post the
Uh,
recording as soon as possible. Thank you very much.